The United States certainly isn't a perfect place, but election season gives people a chance to discuss what they enjoy and loathe about their home country. Political icons like FDR and Ronald Reagan are brought up a lot during elections, but everyone forgets the most essential American of all, Captain America. The son of two Irish immigrants, Steve Rogers may have been born in 1920, but he's constantly growing and adjusting his outlook on life. Characters like Superman and Batman represent fixed ideals of justice that don't change much over time, but Cap doesn't really have static values. Instead, he embodies the ever-changing morals of the US. Introduced 9 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Captain America has been a soldier, a superhero, and a secret agent, constantly shifting roles to suit his evolving beliefs as the world progresses around him. The first time anyone saw Captain America, he was literally punching Hitler in the face. Even though he was introduced a full year before the US officially declared war on Germany, his actions were a clear message that the US opposed the dictator and his beliefs. Without even digging into his backstory or personality, Cap, draped in stars and stripes, was designed as a personified symbol of his country for people to latch onto. Popularized during a period of intense warfare, most of the character's early adventures follow him as he fought soldiers and supervillains supporting the Axis powers. During this era, when it was easier to depict comic book villains as purely evil because they supported real-life monsters, Cap himself represents the convoluted, heroic values of the greatest generation. He happily puts his life on the line to battle regimes that restrict people's freedom, but he also had no problem making racially charged, dehumanizing comments towards his Japanese opponents, a form of racism that was so common at the time, it was even included in patriotic stories meant for children. Captain America definitely achieved a lot of good during the war, but his personality reflected the conflicted nature of American values in the early 20th century. After World War II, as the US shifted its focus from fighting Nazis to containing communism, Captain America's goals changed to better reflect his country's new mission. Despite the fact that Cap and his fellow soldiers spent years fighting alongside Soviet troops to stop the Nazis, he got swept up into Joe McCarthy's Red Scare and became a commie smasher. To placate the Comics Code Authority, an organization that was blaming comic books for juvenile delinquency, Captain America focused on fighting communists in the Soviet Union and the Indochina region from December 1953 to September 1954, re-cementing his status as a figure who directly confronts foes opposed to American values. Despite its societal relevance, Cap's commie fighting days weren't too popular with readers, and he was put back on ice until the Avengers discovered him in 1964. This iteration of the character was more empathetic than his 50s counterpart, and he focused on fighting supervillains instead of tackling real-world foes. As he re-cemented his place in the Marvel Universe, his communist hunting past was completely ignored until 1972, when writer Steve Englehart revealed that Steve Rogers had actually been frozen throughout the 50s, and an FBI-sanctioned imposter served as Cap during the Red Scare. William Burnside, a Captain America fanboy whose hero inspired him to serve his country, injected himself with a homemade super soldier serum. As a result, his mind snapped, causing him to get whipped up into a frenzy and believe statements from figures like McCarthy, who stated that communists were taking over. The introduction of an imposter Captain America, something that happens repeatedly over the years, allows Steve to self-reflect and directly comment on the absurd actions he and his country performed in the past because of his new perspective. During the 70s, when comics were slightly geared more towards adults than children, Cap finally started distancing himself from his country's public values. Englehart, a young writer at the time, did his best to keep the character relevant and tapped into the counterculture that was bubbling up around the US. As the country's youth stood up and protested things like the Vietnam War, Captain America slowly walked back his status as a member of the establishment and did his best to push the government in the right direction. During the original Secret Empire storyline, published right in the middle of all the Watergate hoopla, Captain America discovers a criminal conspiracy that leads all the way up to the White House. Like many of his fellow citizens at the time, Steve Rogers was full of disgust at what he saw around him and felt compelled to redefine himself in opposition to the corruption. A soldier who was used to following the president's orders, Captain America abandons his shield and classic costume during this period to fight crime as Nomad, a term that literally means one without a country. A lot of Americans felt shame in their government after Watergate, and to reflect that, even Cap temporarily gave up on the US. He still fights for truth and justice, but he no longer associated himself with any one nation. In many ways, this is one of the most American things Cap has ever done, because just like the Founding Fathers, he has no problem rebelling against a corrupt status quo when he knows things can improve. Of course, this was short-lived, and Steve eventually donned the stars and stripes again, but it shows that Cap is more attracted to defending classic American values than the country itself. His time as Nomad proves that someone can still be patriotic even while directly protesting their own government, a message of support for young activists who are being hassled across the country. The 80s were an interesting time for Captain America. Not only did he almost run for president in 1980 with the Populist Party, he ultimately walked away from government altogether. After being asked to serve as a formal agent of the US government, Steve Rogers removed America from his title and started fighting crime simply as the Captain. At odds with many of the policies and social norms at the time, Cap served as a beacon of acceptance and understanding throughout the decade. As homophobia was increasing due to the evangelical right's political influence and mania associated with the AIDS crisis, Cap cemented himself as an ally to the LGBT community through the introduction of Arnold Roth, a childhood friend of Steve's who also fought in World War II. After being attacked and brainwashed, Arnie belittles himself for his feelings, but Cap quickly shuts him down. Instead of adhering to the sentiment at the time, Cap reiterates his love for his friend and reminds Arnie that his feelings for his partner are just as pure and real as Steve's own feelings for Bernie, his girlfriend at the time. While his actions didn't directly impact any policy changes, Cap's behavior served as a reminder for readers all over the country that gay people are equally deserving of love and respect. While the 90s had some amazing Captain America comics, I'm looking at you, Mark Waid, the character didn't deal with too much explicitly political material. It was a particularly rough decade for Marvel that saw the publisher go bankrupt in 1996 as they scrambled their properties around to keep them relevant. The failure of the Heroes Reborn initiative, wonderfully covered in my friend Owen's video here, set the stage for the Ultimate line of books and its dramatic reimaginations of classic characters in the early 2000s. A reintroduction of their most iconic heroes in a new, streamlined canon, the Ultimate Universe was a commercial success for Marvel that gave readers gritty, younger versions of decades-old characters. Mark Miller, the future writer of books like Kick-Ass and Kingsman, and Brian Hitch were tasked with recreating the Avengers in this extreme world. Launched 5 months after 9/11, they were reformed as an elite, government-sanctioned squad who were called in to tackle big problems, like metahuman terrorists, and Captain America felt right at home taking orders in this new era. Each Avenger had negative qualities in this gritty world, but Miller's take on Cap was especially frightening. Instead of being depicted as a good old boy who embodied the nostalgic positive qualities of the greatest generation, Captain America was a hardened warrior who longed for the glory days of the past. At one point, just a few months after France blocked a UN resolution that would have authorized George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq, he bluntly insults the nation and essentially calls them cowards. While that may seem out of character for someone who's traditionally friendly with American allies, at that moment, Cap wasn't truly representing his home country. He was embodying the vindictive and petty warhawks who felt so betrayed by France, they relabeled French fries freedom fries. When asked directly by President Bush what he thought of the 21st century, Cap called it cool and embraced the president's neoconservative agenda 1 year before Bush announced the surge in Iraq. Even when faced with the consequences of his actions abroad, this version of Captain America has no problem ignoring the messy realities of his work as he blindly pursues American interests. Miller also had an opportunity to impact Captain America in the core Marvel universe. During Civil War, Steve Rogers once again revolts against his government, this time in opposition to a superhero registration law, because he's afraid what might happen once the state starts telling heroes who to target. Cap and Iron Man had been close friends and allies for years, but instead of sitting down and reasonably discussing the situation, the two spark a dirty war that rips the Marvel Universe apart. Defined by a libertarian outlook that sees him resisting government encroachment in his personal life, Cap firmly stood against the country he previously defended. At its core, Civil War is a satirical look at the hyper-partisan attitudes that swept the country during the Iraq War, with both sides refusing to compromise and instead relying on harsh rhetorical tactics to make their point. Ultimately, Steve Rogers surrenders at the end of the story once he realizes how far he strayed from his original point and how much damage he's caused. An incredibly reflective moment for a stubborn version of the character. Right after Civil War, as the public finally started considering the war in Iraq a mistake, Marvel decided to kill off their symbol of American dignity. During a period in which people idolized the greatest generation and constantly tried to equate the actions of modern veterans with their 20th century counterparts,
Think fast! We did! Yeah!
Bucky Barnes, Steve's former sidekick turned brainwashed assassin, was forced to step into the role. While many former sidekicks try to distance themselves from their mentors, Bucky immediately accepts the responsibility once he learns Steve wanted him to carry the mantle. Bucky, who has his own dark past thanks to the Soviet programming that turned him into the Winter Soldier, spent a lot of his time as Cap looking backwards. As he stepped into the new role, he was forced to deal with the repercussions of all of his past actions. While he may not have been in charge of his own mind, he still performed these crimes and had to deal with looking at himself every morning. A redemptive story, Bucky's years in the suit symbolized America's period of solemn reflection after it got bogged down by division and conflict, and the chance for renewal right as Obama first entered the White House. Even though Steve eventually returns and takes the shield back, Bucky isn't the last person who slipped into his colorful shoes. His longtime friend Sam Wilson, better known as the Falcon, took over as Cap after the villain Iron Nail removed Steve's super soldier serum, causing his body to rapidly age forward. Steve personally picked Sam to take over, and he does a good job not caving into the pressure associated with the high-profile role. On paper, not much distinguishes his values from Steve's at first, but the introduction of a black Captain America in 2014 was an important moment for the character. After a string of innocent black men were killed, beginning with the 2012 murder of Trayvon Martin, a national conversation about the rights and safety of African Americans permeated the mainstream media. As Black Lives Matter evolved from a hashtag into a political movement, it's fitting and symbolically important that Sam Wilson took on the role of being the country's champion and a key leader of the Avengers. While he and Steve remain friends, there are moments where they disagree, and it falls on Sam to champion America's new values in contrast to Steve's older, more traditional outlook. Wilson did a great job wielding the shield, but Steve was ultimately de-aged and once again reclaimed his old title. As fears associated with the candidacy and presidency of Donald Trump first bubbled up, Steve Rogers underwent a dark transformation. During the Avengers standoff storyline, Rogers was de-aged and had his past dramatically rewritten by the Red Skull and a living cosmic cube. Instead of a patriotic hero, Steve was reformed as a Hydra agent who had been silently plotting in the background of the Marvel Universe for years. Throughout the course of Civil War II, he played both sides and sparked a conflict between Iron Man and Captain Marvel in the hopes that he could sow frustration about the so-called elite superheroes with the general population. It's disgustingly fitting that right after the introduction of a black hero who represents the US in the Marvel Universe, Steve Rogers, who used to represent the US positively, became a deeply manipulative, corrupt individual desperate to reshape the world in Hydra's image. Literally 1 week after Trump's inauguration, Captain America was sworn in as the new head of S.H.I.E.L.D. and given unprecedented levels of encroachment power to keep the world safe. Without touching on it too much, because honestly the story is a mess and not too enjoyable, last year's Secret Empire sees Hydra Cap transform the Marvel Universe into a fascist regime. Supported by enhanced surveillance and law enforcement capabilities, Cap even receives congressional approval for S.H.I.E.L.D. to become the nation's top cops in the event of a national emergency, essentially giving him free rein to do whatever he wants during a crisis. The entire event is essentially a confusing blur, but it ends with a pure version of Steve Rogers being introduced and forced to fight the fascist Cap who was manipulating the world. Forcing Captain America to confront another twisted version of himself once again allows Steve to re-examine the world and see what kind of values he believes his home country should exude as the world progresses. Ta-Nehisi Coates, one of the country's most prominent civil rights authors at the moment, is getting a chance to put his own spin on Captain America in his new series. Coates, who describes himself as someone with strong opinions, said he took on the project for his inability to answer a single question. Why do people still believe in the American dream? After all the war, economic disparity, and social injustice, what do people still have faith in? The world may be falling down around us, but Steve Rogers is still there with a smile and a deep desire to make things better. Some people in the US may be slipping into tribalism and feel more afraid than appreciative of their neighbors, but in this new era of hatred, Steve happily defends everyone. He's not a perfect man, but Steve has no problem constantly reassessing his own behavior and personality as he takes on new challenges and keeps moving forward. A pure soul who has no problem sacrificing himself for others, Steve is the aspirational figure everyone should strive to be. Unfortunately, his altruistic nature and sculpted body are unattainable goals for most people. Just like the American dream itself, Steve represents a level of success that is meant to be sought after instead of truly achieved by everyone. Just like the country he represents, he may have troubled moments in his past, but Cap constantly examines himself and adapts to better fit the times, and that's something we should all strive to do.